Hi, my name is Kaitlyn Piotrowski, and today I'll be talking about my Keystone project, College and COVID-19, Perceived Changes in Cognitive Function and Mental Health. So the COVID-19 pandemic has left lasting impacts on both our personal well-being as well as society as a whole, and current research has focused primarily on the acute physical symptoms of the virus, but there have been long-term cognitive and behavioral health issues displayed, especially in young adult populations, but they're less understood. And so the current knowledge surrounding long COVID that we have right now is that it is a condition with an array of different symptoms that vary widely in timing, course, and outcomes. As you can see here, it affects many different systems within the body, and specifically today, I'll be focusing on its effects on mental health and the nervous system. So the pandemic has affected our lives in ways well beyond just the presence of an infection, though. It can impact different aspects of what are known as social determinants of health. And so these are things such as social support networks, food and healthcare access, economics, education, and your environment. The high prevalence of psychological distress within college-age students has been a growing concern prior to and following the onset of the pandemic. And so in order to better understand this increase in mental health decline, I aimed with my study to shift the focus on COVID-19 symptom type from the more physical to the mental and from the more short-term to the long-term, as well as explore the interactions between personal and public health and understand their impact on cognitive behavioral well-being. So for my methodology, I distributed a survey to 472 Boston University students over the course of 5 months, and it was during the summer to fall 2022 semester transition. And I felt like this was a pivotal time to conduct this research since it had been the first time since 2020 that all health regulations and pandemic restrictions have been lifted on campus. So in order to get a better picture of the subjective well-being of students during this time, I measured many different things. So I measured daily life on campus, so student demographics, their routines, and their health-related behaviors. I measured their quality of life through things such as their social support networks, their coping strategies, their positive affect, and their ability to participate in their social roles and activities. I measured their cognitive and mental health through things such as executive functioning, depression, anxiety, as well as sleep issues and emotional and behavioral control. And finally, I measured pandemic experiences through whether or not they had a previous infection before, what type of symptoms they showed, as well as something called COVID-19 impact, which is how I will be measuring the pandemic's influence on those social determinants of health that I mentioned before. In terms of demographics, I had a majority female sample, and I found that non-binary and female students performed significantly worse than male students in all of the cognitive and mental health measures, most of the quality of life measures, as well as they had a more severe COVID-19 impact. In terms of student and race demographics, I interestingly did not find any overwhelming differences within the subgroups, but I did have a majority freshman sample and a majority white and Asian student sample. 57% of my sample reported having a previous COVID-19 infection, with 39% of those displaying long-term symptoms. In comparing COVID-19 infection with impact, I did not find any differences in any of the cognitive behavioral or quality of life health measures based on personal infection status. But interestingly though, I did find that all of the measures were displaying significant correlations with COVID-19 impact instead. So those who experienced short-term symptoms, they only had a higher COVID-19 impact overall. They didn't have any effects on their mental or cognitive well-being, but symptom count did correlate with worsened anxiety, sleep issues, as well as their ability to participate in their social roles. Those who experienced long-term symptoms had a much wider array of effects. They had a higher COVID-19 impact, worse cognitive and behavioral outcomes, and a reduced quality of life. And symptom count seemed to only exacerbate performance on all of these different measures. So what I have here is a graph showing the average COVID-19 impact on the y-axis and my 3 groups that I'm studying on the x-axis. So I have the no infection group, the infection without long-term symptoms group, and the infection with long-term symptoms group. And I found that the group with long-term symptoms displayed had a significantly higher COVID-19 impact than the other 2. So there seems to be some interaction between personal health measures, so long COVID, and public health measures, COVID-19 impact. And I wanted to figure out the directionality of this relationship. So I did that by running multiple regression analyses in order to find predictors for COVID-19 impact and executive functioning. So what I have here, if you're interested, are my residual checks. My models passed the test for linearity, and In the field of psychology, an adjusted R-square value of greater than 0.25 is typically considered a good model just because it is very difficult to quantify things such as mental and cognitive health. So these are my models that I found. I found that COVID-19 impact was predicted by short-term and long-term symptom presence, maladaptive coping strategies, anxiety, sleep disturbance, and an inability to participate in social roles. In terms of executive functioning, I found that it was predicted by substance use, emotional and behavioral discontrol, sleep disturbance, and most notably COVID-19 impact. So there seems to be a potential pathway for cognitive behavioral pathogenesis in college-age students. It looks as though the more long-term symptoms one is displaying, the worse in COVID-19 impact they have, which is leaving detrimental effects on their executive functioning. So with all of this in mind, I decided to ask students what aspects of life during the pandemic really contributed to these impacts in their cognitive and behavioral health. So those that reported negative impacts said that the isolation, the health-related worry, the loss of control, the diminished mental capacity, and the pessimistic outlook was what was contributing to this decline. So I have some quotes here from this group. So I feel less optimistic about the future because I think everyone was trained to expect the worst during the pandemic. It happened during a very critical point in my adolescence where I should have been interacting with friends and teachers regularly, but that stopped all of a sudden for so long. The pandemic has left my study habits and procrastination much worse. It has stunted my attention span growth. On the other hand, those that reported positive impacts on their cognitive behavioral health said that the pandemic gave them the time for self-care, consistent access to help at home, as well as mindful reflection on their experiences throughout the entire pandemic and having a more optimistic outlook on their experiences. In conclusion, cognitive behavioral impairments are not based solely on infection, but rather on a holistic view of pandemic-related experiences affecting quality of life and well-being. And more awareness on the long-lasting impacts of the pandemic will be vital in mitigating this exacerbating interaction between personal and public health determinants. So I have some additional resources here. If you're interested, you can scan this QR code, but I have my research paper if you're interested in the study and the analyses I ran. And I also have a white paper I created about the importance of holistic healthcare during the post-pandemic transition. But thank you so much for listening, and I want to give a special thanks to Kilachand Honors College, as well as my research advisor, Dr. Cronin Galam, in her lab for all the help and guidance throughout the course of this project.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Do we have any questions? We have ample time for any questions.
It's my job. I'm one of the postdocs. I'll always have a question ready. All right. This is a great presentation. I'm curious if any of your positive or negative pandemic outlooks, right, these things that you were talking about at the end, if those lined up or correlated with any specific demographics, right? Like, is it that people who are maybe identifying as one gender or in one socioeconomic stratus, right? Like, does that affect whether or not they're positively or negatively?
Yeah, so I did try and run some tests on my qualitative data and tried to see any demographic information, see if it lined up. I did find more it was about long-term symptom presence and relative COVID impact. So I compared the groups based on if they had a high COVID impact or a low, and if they had long-term symptoms or not. And I actually found that those that either had a high COVID impact regardless of long-term symptom presence, or if they just had long-term symptoms, they had significantly more of these negative impacts and less of those positive. And the only group that had less negative impacts and more positive was the no long-term symptoms and then low relative impact group. So in terms of demographics, that's what I ended up being able to look at. Yeah.
It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Did you find that there was a particular group that was in the long-term COVID sufferers?
A specific, you mean in terms of demographics?
Yes.
I think it was definitely, I don't think there was really any demographic differences overall. It was very correlated with that COVID impact, so that's why I ended up running the regression analyses to see which direction it ran, but overall, it seemed like everyone was experiencing some form of long-term symptom, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.